I'm Gil Cedillo. I'm a member of the Los Angeles City Council. I represent the First Councilmatic District. It is perhaps the most immigrant district in the nation. It's a district that has large pockets of poverty and is reflective of the country in terms of the divide between wealth and poverty. And it exists in my district as well because I have some really high-end communities like Mount Washington and Highland Park, one of the top hipster communities of the nation. And at the same time, I have very immigrant-dense communities like the Pico Union area or the Westlake area of Los Angeles. And so my policies and my efforts and my work on behalf of those communities is reflected in the policies that I promote. Well, in the early 90s, I was living what I thought was my best life. I was head of Local 660 SEIU. It was its largest public sector local this side of New York. It represented 40,000 Los Angeles County workers. I had been at the helm of that union for in my third year. In 1991, when I took over the leadership of the local, we had an 11-day strike called Rolling Thunder, and it began to set a culture for how that union would operate in the politics of Southern California. We began to utilize a labor community strategy, a very public, high-profile strategy. And so in 1994, I was in my third year of leading that local. We were focused on getting a new governor for the state of California. We were going to be very involved in Kathleen Brown's campaign. And so that's what I was doing in 1994. Well, there had been a trend for some period of time, particularly with the immigration reform in the mid-'80s. But even before that, this ongoing integration of immigrants into the workforce, into important industries of the economy, in light manufacturing, in the service economy. Clearly, they were beginning to permeate and play a major role in the success of those economies. And at the same time, there was a decline, a major decline of the American economy, particularly in heavy manufacturing and in aerospace. And so concurrently with immigrants moving into other important sectors of the economy, there was extraordinary job loss. Immigrants were not responsible for that. Those were policy decisions and products of the global economy. But nevertheless, they were scapegoated during that time period for the job loss that was becoming evident throughout the state and throughout the nation. You know, I remember very vividly the early discussions of Proposition 187, and I remember distinctly that many of my old colleagues, my old people I grew up with, my friends of mine who were pro-immigrant activists when we were all in college in the 70s, that they were talking about this Proposition 187, the Save Our State initiative, as it was called initially at the time, and that there was a demonstration in downtown Los Angeles. And so some of my close friends, Joel Ochoa, who was the leader of the Machinists Union, Kathy Ochoa, his wife at the time, who worked for me, were going to go downtown to see this demonstration and invited me to join them. And so I remember driving down with them to the demonstration. And I was impressed by two things. One was the size of the march. It was very large, and it seemed very large for a march that didn't seem to have a lot of publicity at the time. And then also impressed by the lack of infrastructure, professional infrastructure, for that size of a march. They didn't have a stage. They didn't have a very large PA system. It seemed odd that such a large march and rally with so many people didn't arrive to a place where there was a infrastructure in place for them. And so I worked my way to the front of the podium and said hello to some of my colleagues, Juan Jose Gutierrez, who was the executive director of One Stop Immigration, one of the sponsors of the march, and invited them to join me at my local and said, you know, we'd be happy to work with you. We have PA systems. We use them for our demonstrations. We have a lot of resources at our local. We'd be happy to work with you, and we could share those resources with you. And so I remember that Saturday very vividly. We were all very young, and young at heart we remained, but we were all very, very young. I was happy to see Juan Jose. We had been colleagues and very close while we were in college. And after that, we remained very close, but we didn't see each other as much. I went to law school, and I was in the labor movement. That was my world, and my world was in the public sector, so I didn't interface with the immigrant workforce much at all. And so I didn't see them as much as I had wished to. And so I was happy to see them, as I was to see Nativo and Bert. And I remember I invited them to come over because we were in the spring, we were getting ready for our efforts in the primary election. We were going to select who our candidates were, whether it was Tom Hayden, John Garamendi, or Kathleen Brown. We were very active in preparing for that. And so I invited them to my office on a Saturday afternoon, and we sat there and talked about what I was doing and how we could help, and what I thought were the advantages of them working with labor. And they brought these two young, enthusiastic young men, Kevin De Leon and Fabian Nunez, much younger than they are today, very modest. I remember we were sitting around and we had a big work table in my office and a big couches. My office was really large. It was like a lounge in some respects. And so we had a big bowl of fruit and snacks on the table. And I said, well, help yourself, and then go in the next room. And if you want some coffee or tea, go ahead and help yourself, any beverage. And, they seemed a little hesitant, like they were worried they were going to be charged for the snacks. And I said, no. Help yourself. It's, this is when you work in the labor movement, this is, what resources are available. And I remember inviting them to join us in the labor movement because you could see immediately how bright both of them were. And I said, no, you guys should come and should think about working for us. I have an interest in feeding you, and my interest is that I want in the future for you guys to join us in the labor movement because I could see that you guys are obviously bright and very smart and committed. And they were not interested in mainstream politics that I represented to them, I guess, at the time. But again, we were all, as I said, very, very young. And of course, our futures would change. Well, for us, it was obviously anti-immigrant. It was a desperate act by not unlike what we see in the nation today, where there are people who are struggling with changes in the economy, struggling with changes in demographics, find a comfort in racism and nativism, and who look to that in terms of trying to gain political advantage. We were very confident and understood for decades that immigrants played a vital role in the economy, and that they didn't take jobs, and in many instances they helped make businesses prosperous and in essence create jobs, and that they paid taxes, that like all immigrants since the beginning of this nation came to this country to improve their personal lives, but more so to improve the lives of their children, and that they were very optimistic people who wanted to contribute. And so we had confidence in that worldview, but it was being confronted by a movement that was trying to exploit the difficult changes in the economy at that time. At that time, there wasn't much involvement or interest in the anti-immigrant activities taking place, emerging in the state during that time period. It was a very difficult economy. We were in a recession. There were going to be cutbacks. And unions were still, in many instances, following the old policies of the AFL-CIO. So they weren't pro-immigrant and very progressive, other than those unions that were trying to organize immigrants in the industries that they were in. For example, the janitors obviously was a immigrant-based workforce, and so they were focused obviously on immigrants. HERE, the hotel employee and restaurant employee union, was also focused on organizing immigrants. But they had their own internal battles They had to sue their own union to make sure that the contracts could be written in Spanish, that the meetings would be conducted in Spanish. So the unions were not leading the charge in defense of immigrants at that time. So there was emerging leadership in the labor movement. So there were young people who had come out of the immigrant rights groups, Maria Elena Durazo, for example, with HERE, Mike Garcia, with the Janitors Union was emerging. I had a history working with them in college in the pro-immigrant group, CASA, and had worked with Bert Corona and Nativo Lopez. So there was a group of young people who were now in leadership posts of unions who had a very pro-immigrant perspective. This was contrary to other unions within our internationals and other locals who didn't share that perspective. There was also people like Cristina Ramirez, who was leading the Lady Garment Workers Union. So there were various new leaders emerging who were pro-immigrant and saw the demographic change and could see that this was going to be important to organize them. It's a very critical moment in the history of the American labor movement, because for the first time, there are union leaders of significant positions as leaders of large locals and important locals who are advocating for organizing immigrants. And this is a major shift in the policy of the American labor movement. And it was a precursor to an official policy change that took place a few years later, and much of it as a result of seeing that the immigrant workforce was could become a very pro-immigrant workforce, militant, advocate for their own rights, and play a role in organizing and in organized labor as a force, because organized labor had been on a steady decline since the early to mid-'70s as the structure of the economy changed and as the unions were unable to be nimble enough to expand into other sectors or to anticipate the changes. Labor was in a steady decline, and now you were seeing the emergence of unions that were gaining workers because they were organizing the immigrant workforce. And so there was a conflict. There were, in fact, some members, leadership people within my union who were opposed to our efforts to defeat 187 and opposed to our strategy and tactics. Our strategy was to build a broad-based coalition, built around labor as the leading force, utilizing the resources of the labor movement, but then bringing in other groups like faith-based organizations and the church, bringing in other groups like the immigrant rights groups like Hermandad Mexicana and One Stop Immigration, obviously working with people in the legal community. That was our strategy, and we actually had the belief that we could beat this by mobilizing democratic forces to beat this proposition, and also mobilize these forces around Kathleen Brown's campaign to energize her campaign. She was leading in the polls significantly at the time. History, demonstrates that we were off, that we didn't have enough of a base of a membership, that the demographics weren't as we had thought, and that we underestimated, and I think we saw this again recently in the presidential, underestimated the fear, the uncertainty that was taking place in the broader society because of the changes in the economy. And so the point is that not all of labor was agreeing on these approaches, but that there was enough people there to lead and push our efforts, which ultimately was embraced a few years later by the entire labor movement, and with a national policy change and with initiatives throughout the country to organize the immigrant workforce. Organized labor is a small part of the American workforce and American society, but it's very powerful. It's very powerful because it has a long, rich history. It has a history of bringing people together from diverse backgrounds. It has an important place in the economy. But one of the areas that makes it very powerful is that as an institution, it has incredible resources, so that the membership, through their dues, pays to sustain the union movement. And so by bringing the union movement into these other grassroots and community-based organizations, you're bringing a lot of power. You're bringing expertise with the media. You're bringing the experiences of the union leaders into the realm of politics and those political relationships that exist with labor, and then you're bringing infrastructure. You're bringing hard cash to pay for buses or for grand stages or for permits to create marches and demonstrations. You're bringing printing presses at the time, before social media. Printing presses were very important. You're bringing incredible expertise. So bringing the labor movement into this other movement on behalf of immigrants was really powerful. It played a major role that I think has been underappreciated in the review and the thoughts in terms of what role did labor play against 187. It was a turning point, I would say, for the immigrant rights movement, but also a turning point for labor, and it was a historic moment where both of these intersected on behalf of their interests. There was a belief that somehow, and you see it in today's current discussion about who should lead the Democratic Party against Donald Trump. You know, is it the left or is it the center? And the same discussions, in many respects, were taking place at that time. Should we be modest and moderate and try to maybe, not talk about immigrants that much and, downplay the role, or should we be very affirmative about it and be, make clear what the choices are and what people's decisions are how those decisions will impact their lives and the role that immigrants play in our society. And we were just very affirmative about it. We thought that we should build a very broad coalition, as I've stated before, and be very open about it. We thought, that there was a noble message that we could construct about building a broad coalition based upon values of integration, about the contributions of immigrants, the immigrant heritage, the forward-looking nature of immigrants, that we could build a message around that and that we could mobilize people. And through the incredible resources that we had, that we could mobilize people. Others simply didn't share that. They relied on the polls. They relied on the more conservative voters that they were focused on. And I think electorally, they may have been right electorally, but I think in terms of a social movement and societal change, that we were obviously absolutely right. And I think history has shown that. And so we may both have been right in some reflection. But yeah, there were definitely people who were not for it within my union as well. I mean, there were people who were hell-bent on making sure that we didn't have the march and that the march didn't get support and who wanted to marginalize it. And it was very, very unfortunate, and it was really difficult, I know for me personally during that time period, not to have the full support of my union at the time when we were such a leading force and contributor within SEIU. Our union was one of its biggest stars and was making great contributions both to our members but to SEIU. Not to have their full support at that time was disconcerting, but not discouraging. We went forward nonetheless and went forward with our march. It was historic, something that we're proud of. It was making history, and we did that. But there were other forces in our society, democratic forces. The Speaker of the State Assembly, the leadership at LA County, the leadership at the Los Angeles Unified School Board, who were, and prominent leaders trying to discourage people from working with us and participating with us. We found that to be unfortunate, but that's not unlike what's happening today in our efforts to see who will lead our nation in the future. As I said, and we may both have been right, and there's a distinction between this electoral strategy and a broader strategy of trying to move our society forward. And this is, the debate that's taking place today in the Democratic Party with respect to, you go with, a Bernie Sanders, or do you go with a more conservative Joe Biden, right? And so the challenge that exists is there's incredible stress in our society. And people are having job loss, and their privileges in the society are changing, and it's stressful. And then we have a person in the White House who's saying, and it's stressful because of immigrants. Immigrants are taking your job. They're responsible for the decline of your circumstance and why nothing works in government, et cetera, et cetera. So immigrants are scapegoated at the highest levels of our country. It's the first time a campaign for presidency began specifically attacking immigrants. And so there's a small part of the population that is convinced of that. And that was also true in 1994. The demographics and the polling was that there was this voter in Encino, they called the Encino man or the Encino voter. And, you know, we had to pander to him. We had to accommodate him. Our perspective was that, no, you need to broaden the base and you need to persuade people and inspire people. And I still feel the same way. I think that for the Democrats going forward, that it's about you need to address those concerns, and there's enough facts to address those concerns because it's not based on truth or facts. But the fact of the matter is that there are more voters to organize, that there's a broader base to organize, and that there's no reason why the Democrats can't amplify their base, that their strategy should be amplify and persuade and inspire, and that we can take back this nation. And that tension existed in 1994 around immigrants, and it exists today around our core values in terms of how we see the nation going forward. And immigration is central to that, whether it's DACA or TPS, whether it's immigration reform. That is something that's central and key, and we need to recognize that and continue to advocate for that. We were able to, for example, immediately go set up meetings with Richard Alatorre, who I think was head of the Public Safety Committee. He was then brought in, the LAPD, to sit with us and for us to lay out the ground rules, to lay out our planning. Again, working with Richard Alatorre and Mike Hernandez, making sure we had the infrastructure in place, enough restrooms, enough spaces for the public to get respite along the way. That's a product of what the labor movement brings. It's a certain legitimacy at that time that they brought to all the other efforts from the community going forward. And so we worked with the LAPD. It was a little tough initially because some of the activists aren't comfortable with that, aren't used to sitting down, don't have the confidence yet to sit down with the LAPD or with other institutions to say, look, here's our objective. Let's figure out how we can work to accomplish your objective, and then let's do that. We were able to monitor and sit down in those negotiations and make a plan that everybody agreed to, and fortunately that everybody respected. And so, we've done marches our whole lives, and so we are very strict about certain things like, no provocations, no alcohol at the event. These are very serious ventures for us. I was very adamant that we have this type of collaboration and cooperation with the city because I represent 40,000 members, which is 40,000 families, and they wouldn't take lightly to us getting them involved in some activities that were going to be that would result in the types of other problems people may have had in the past or subsequent working with LAPD. It was obviously very exciting. I remember at the time where I was living in Pasadena, so many people coming to my house because we were all going in the morning. Obviously very nervous, as I am always whenever I'm doing public speaking or speaking to a camera. Lots of people at my house getting ready to go down to downtown. I remember listening to my go-to Marvin Gaye and his great What's Going On, and so I was listening to that. And then I was communicating with our communications and logistics people, and they were giving me great reports of people amassing throughout the area, the meeting point, and great reports from the helicopter of what the turnout was beginning to look like. And then we went down to the start. Now it was kind of awkward because we weren't quite sure logistically how we were going to start the march, right? Like, how do you start a march of 100,000 people or more? Who knows where you go to learn that? So I know we were all there. We had wanted to have thousands and thousands of American flags, but Mariloca had run out of money paying for buses. Then, flags we didn't put enough money aside for. So I remember us at the meeting point, Father Villagran, Juan Jose, myself, Richard Alarcon was there. And I remember we had Boy Scouts there, a Boy Scout troop, and we wanted to give a very pro-American image of immigrants in this country. But we had to start, and then we just said, okay, well, let's do this. So we just kind of locked arms and started walking forward. We were right there at what was Brooklyn, now Chavez, Brooklyn and Lorena. It's called Five Points, kind of famous spot in Bora Heights, East Los Angeles. And so we just locked arms and started walking, and people started joining us and following us, and then it just grew. And there were others. I remember Jack Henning, the head of the AFL-CIO, came down from Sacramento. He's an old man, very old man, but he wanted to be there. He wanted to walk, be part of the leadership of that march. And I remember him joining us. I was a little worried about his health at the time, and then I remember seeing some famous, Casey Kasem was with us, but there were other famous actors along the side who just waved to them to come and join us. So that was it. It was a long march. I remember coming under the tunnel. We were coming under the tunnel and then just coming out, and there's so much noise, the echo of the tunnel. It was very emotional for me to be there at that moment and to come through. I remember my family joining me and the support of my family. Unfortunately, my wife, who was ill much during that time period, was not available to join us on that day. But I remember the support of my family, my niece and nephew, in a little cart, and us pulling them along in the little wagon, a little red wagon. And then I remember just us getting to downtown, walking up the hill and down the hill. It was incredible to see a mass of people like that. It was very powerful. It was very inspiring. Well, we anticipated that. Obviously, that's why we were, very adamant in our efforts that we would have the clergy with us, men and women and callers in the march, Father Villarroyo at the beginning, that we had the Boy Scouts, that we did these things that, were manifestations of being very patriotic today, and being an immigrant is in many respects very patriotic in its essence. So we were thoughtful about that. We anticipated it, so we weren't surprised. I wasn't surprised. Obviously, we wanted to do more with American flags, but at some point, it wasn't about any of that. It was about a bad economy. It's about a rich history of anti-immigration and racism in the state of California. And it was about, really difficult times for people we're going through and the changes of the economy. I mean, literally, we're closing auto plants. The factory where my father worked had closed a few years earlier. The aerospace industry is just really losing jobs by the thousands on a monthly basis. So those were difficult circumstances for people to deal with, and so blaming immigrants is something that people, do historically. We know that with today's president, Donald Trump, that's a tried and true way of distracting people. And so ultimately that was more prevalent than whether or not somebody had a Mexican flag or was demonstrating how proud they were of the countries they came from. It may not have been helpful, but it wasn't determinative. Well, Pete Wilson has a long history in the state of California. He was a mayor in San Diego, and so he was a mayor of one of the major border towns of the country. He was also a senator a U.S. senator in the U.S. Senate. He had also been involved in the immigration reform. Immigrant rights groups would sometimes go to him to work with him both in San Diego as mayor and as a U.S. senator. He has a long history in governance in the state of California. He was obviously the governor and then reelected as the governor. In 1993, he supported initiatives to raise taxes, which was for Republicans something really difficult. It's not something that's looked upon favorably by the very conservative Republicans, the fiscal conservatives within the Republican Party. But he had supported tax increases in the early 90s as efforts to try to keep the state afloat during this impending recession. Look, Latinos play California's the lead in the resistance and the anti-Trump movement of the nation. It's one of the bluest states, if not the bluest state in the nation. Our perspective is that this is much a product of the labor movement, which, while we lost that election in '94, we won the governor's office in '98. We've won all the constitutional offices since then, other than the aberration of Schwarzenegger. The coalition of the labor movement and immigrant rights groups and Latinos has been a major force in the development of California's political perspective. And, you know, California is like the 5th largest economy in the world. You cannot ignore the contributions, whether it's in Silicon Valley or whether it's in the garment industry or in the incredible role that the service economy plays on California's economy, that immigrants play a major role in that. And so you couple that with unions who were organizing and being very thoughtful about their political agenda, began to elect people who were very now explicit, very openly pro-immigrant. And so you start with the Marco Fireballs and Antonio Villaraigosa and I both come out of that pro-immigrant movement from the 70s. But the elections of people like Fabian Nunez and Kevin De Leon, who rise to the top positions of the state legislature, both on the Assembly and the state Senate. And it's hard to find, when you look at California today, with its sanctuary state, with a driver's license for immigrant motorists, with the California DREAM Act, with professional licenses for immigrants in the state of California, for all the various legislative initiatives that have taken place in California that are pro-immigrant. It's hard to think of that a mere 25 years ago, that there were propositions that were trying to kick children out of schools and deny them medical services. That's a sea change of historic proportion. So all those relationships we talked about, and even in '93, the efforts for Chicano studies at UCLA and the people who were involved in that, all these forces had come together around 187. I left SEIU abruptly in '96, worked for a short minute with the United Food and Commercial Workers. In 1997, I was elected in the primary and began work in the first week of 1998 in the state legislature. I followed, ironically, Luis Caldera, who had played a role in the legislation to remove the driver's license from immigrant motorists. It was a policy of the state since the 30s, since almost the advent of the vehicle, the car. And so I came to Sacramento. During that time period, many of these immigrant groups continued to work with our union in our efforts to save the healthcare system in 1995. And so that coalition and that dialogue was ongoing at that point. In my district, in many of the little meetings I would go to, in Pico Union, for example, people would talk to me and approach me about their cars being taken away from them because they didn't have a driver's license. So that issue is emerging on behalf of immigrants. In a meeting with Nativo Lopez, he brought it to our attention that this was an issue for them in Orange County, that he wanted us to work on it. And so naively, naivete has been one of my strategic perspectives in much of my work. I went to Sacramento, and I introduced a bill that would mitigate the damages of people having their cars towed. And that was squashed immediately. I couldn't even get a second. I got a courtesy second from a very nice Republican from Chino, and the bill was squashed by the Democrats. So when we went back, with Gray Davis winning in the fall, and we went back to the legislature, we thought, why are we working on the edges? It's bad policy. It was only done because people didn't like immigrants and thought this was going to hurt them. But it was really bad public policy. It was bad policy for the highways for the state. So we reintroduced it, but we introduced it to completely restore all the driving privileges and responsibilities to immigrants. It was amazing that this bill was introduced. I got a hearing, but again, it was just crushed in the beginning. I think the next year we introduced it and we moved it forward and we got it through the Assembly side. And I thought, oh my God, what great progress. And then we had to go to the Senate. And we went to the Senate, and again, it was crushed, and mostly by Democrats. And so it's tough. I remember presenting it to Dick Mountjoy was on the committee. Dick Mountjoy, who was the author of Proposition 187, and I'm introducing the bill, and I'm looking up at him because the senators sit up on this dais, and his head looks like it's going to explode. And his face gets all red, and I'm looking at this man, and it looks like he's going to just like blow up. And I'm just sitting there thinking, okay, let's see what he says. And so then he starts on a rant about immigrants, and I said, it's very interesting, but that's not really relevant to what we're proposing here. This is about highway safety. And, everything you said may be true or not true, it's debatable, but it has nothing to do with our proposal. And there's no reason why immigrants shouldn't drive, as they have always driven. We did great research on the history of the DMV and of licensing in the state of California, and there was no reason why immigrants shouldn't drive in the state of California. So it died in that committee. It took us about a year or two before we were able to get it out of the committees into the governor's desk. Of course, the governor's desk was a whole different story. Initially vetoed, we were going to fix it. We had made some adjustments to it, and our meeting was scheduled for the morning of 9/11/01. And that's when we were getting ready to talk about the bill signing and everything related to the bill. And then, of course, 9/11 happens, and everybody goes crazy. And security becomes a concern, and then there's a discussion that these terrorists had driver's licenses, and so all of a sudden that becomes even a greater burden at the time. It's like anti-immigration, but like on steroids, and it was made it much more challenging and more difficult. Look, we are in a very unromantic moment in American history. Racism and anti-immigrant hysteria, nativism is just at a high level, one of its highest levels. It's offensive, it's obscene to us from this perspective. You can't imagine the president begins his campaign attacking immigrants, Mexicans specifically. His ignorance is, pervasive. He attacks other nations as being states of Mexico. Mexicans are blamed for everybody's problem. The further away from the border, people seem somehow to be more threatened by immigrants. And so if in Montana somebody hears somebody speaking Spanish, even though the person's a citizen, they're calling the authorities to come and investigate this person. I mean, this is crazy. This is like unthinkable. These people are citizens, and yet to simply be out and to be an immigrant, whether you're a citizen or not, is a difficult and threatening circumstance and situation for anyone. Children are placed in cages at the border. Families are separated. Kids are taken from their families. We're violating not only American law, but international law with respect to the immigrants. You have some of the most draconian figures in the White House. This young man from Santa Monica, Stephen Miller, this is a very sad person who needs perhaps therapy, and yet is taking his hate right into the main corridors of the White House and is dictating much of the president's immigration policy and disposition. This is horrible. You add that with the others who were part of the original cabal of people around the questions of immigration, Steve Bannon and the other guy from Kansas. These people are just mean-spirited. They're ignorant. They don't understand history. They're on the wrong side of history. But nevertheless, that brings no comfort to an immigrant in this nation today. And so we need to confront this at every point, which is why I'm proud that Los Angeles is a city of sanctuary, why we are constructing our own rules, regulations, and laws to protect immigrants, but not just immigrants, gays, LGBTQ, African Americans, Muslims, women. I mean, this is a scary moment in our nation, and we remain committed to change, peaceful change, but this is challenging, and it's threatening, and you see its impact on the global stage, on our relationships and our alliances throughout the world, and around our efforts to be thought of as a peacekeeping nation and a contributor to peace in the world. All that is in jeopardy. Immigrants are part of this, and we have a role to play in pushing back against this president, this administration, and those who follow him. So with respect to DACA today and immigration reform, they're essential. And as the author of the California Dream Act, it's a very simple statement. Young people brought here through no choice of their own should be given every opportunity to live here, to develop themselves. The history shows that they're all prepared to make great contributions to our society. There's a big array of people who have been successful, who came here, who were brought by their parents and didn't have legal status. Jose Hernandez, the astronaut from California, the Dr. Q, the great doctor at Johns Hopkins. There's a whole range of literature of people who were brought here by their parents, had undocumented status for a while, and then went on to make great contributions to our society. And so clearly, DACA was a step forward. It could have been a bigger step. It should have been a bigger step, but it is a step forward that has to be protected. At the same time, we need to advocate and go beyond that. DACA recipients and their families should be integrated into the mainstream. And immigration reform for the 11 plus million people, we need to have that now. But what's important is for people to understand that today, what they have as a status of DACA is a product of the efforts of Proposition 187 and the movements that were built then. That the efforts to get a driver's license at this moment still remains perhaps the most significant victory for immigrants in the last 25 years. The 1.2 million in California who have gotten a driver's license, the 900,000 in New York, literally millions of people will have a right to drive, get the privilege to drive in their states as a product of this movement that emerged out of the fight against 187. And the fight against 187 has its roots in those people who were members of CASA and the other immigrant rights groups of the 70s, and historic figures like Bert Corona, who's been doing this or who did this during his life since the 30s, organizing people and fighting for the rights of immigrants. So there's a long, rich history in terms of advocacy on behalf of immigrants, all immigrants, and so those who are the beneficiaries today need to know and understand that they are a product of history. They've got their own destiny, they've got their own battles to fight, but those are simply the next stage and the next chapter of a very rich history of immigrants in this nation. I think America can learn that there's no point in fighting the inevitability of this nation's ongoing destiny of integrating immigrants into their mainstream. That this is, from its beginning and its future, is a nation of immigrants. It's unique in that way, and that we can learn that there's really no point and value of scapegoating immigrants when there's problems of our economy, that what we need to do is embrace their talent, embrace their optimism, and embrace their commitment to their vision to a better future. That commitment manifests in what they do for their families, what their families do for the community, and how this all makes the nation a greater nation, that makes America the place that everybody wants to come to. And that, in essence, by being pro-immigrant, you are being pro-American. And so I think that is the lesson that Americans need to understand, that just like the story of their families, these same stories of people who are coming here who may speak another language, who will take a generation to assimilate, it's going to happen regardless, and that what we should do is embrace it, set up social infrastructure for it, and take advantage of it as fast as we can. You know, I'm a very powerful person in many respects, particularly for a young kid from Borough Heights. I've been a state senator, traveled the world, I've spoken at the UN, I've met powerful people, I know powerful people. But when I'm out in public, I recognize that I'm, in the eyes of many, just another Mexican. And recently I went to go visit a friend of mine. I was taking some food, just walking in, they opened the door for this secure area, and I get confronted about not being able to enter the building. What am I doing? I mean, it was really offensive and very unfortunate, because it was here in my district. It was here in this great city of Los Angeles. But it's very evident that the people were the woman was trying to stop me from going forward because I was a Mexican. And she didn't think I belonged there. And she didn't want me there. And it's not the first time. And it's not atypical in unfortunately, in many areas of, our nation to be confronted like that. And it requires someone to be very affirmative, to understand, obviously, the limits of what they can do, but also to engage that affirmatively and assert your rights that you have.